I'd like to discuss point-based models relative to impact assessment. I also want to highlight that there are two tracks: testing and improving models and then using the models. And I feel that we're still not finished with testing the models for the responsiveness to CO2 and temperature and a lot of other management factors. Very briefly reviewing some of the crop modeling teams: wheat, maize, rice, sugarcane, potato. There's a maize model improvement group that's separate from the maize team. There's a soil carbon mineralization team and a bioenergy team led by Kakani and LeBauer, nuke, canola, peanut, sorghum, and a crop water ET. And just for the record, these first three teams have done a lot of work already, several papers published. There are 33 wheat models evaluated, 23 maize, 16 for rice. Now, the first step in the activity that these teams followed was to test the sensitivity of the models to temperature, to CO2, and then it sort of diverted, sometimes rainfall, sometimes nitrogen. But it was 4 sentinel sites, but I would say it's data-free in terms of the response to the factor. So it was not a model test necessarily, using standard protocols. The teams now are into testing against observed data on the response to CO2 and temperature, and about to get into looking at ET. That requires good data, time series as well as end of season data, and code improvements. And something that we need to get into is how to do the adaptations. And I would also argue technology change trends. Now, what we've learned so far, that we need multi-model. The median of the ensembles of these 33 or 23 models predicts the observed yield quite well, but a single model doesn't. There are still uncertainties on the CO2 temperature water response. The consistent message is that yield is reduced with rising temperature, mostly shorter life cycle, and that brings up what I would call really what I think first adaptation needs to be, is to regain the life cycle rather than what we call heat tolerance. And then we also have elevated temperature effects on phenology and the grain set that are not modeled that well. And the modelers are testing their models against response data, and the code improvement is beginning. I'm hoping it gets a lot further along before we do the hardcore assessments with this group. I should also point out that what we'll talk about for the point-based models really needs to apply for the gridded models. They are really point-based models at grid points, but there's another set of models there that may have potentially even less complexity and less ability to simulate some of these things. So those same questions about how correct they are for the response to CO2 temperature, genetic adaptation needs to be, I would say, challenged. Okay, this is the wheat team's first work. The X's point out to the observed yield in these 4 sentinel sites. The first box and whisker shows you all they gave them was the soil information, management, and weather, and anthesis maturity date. It said, now simulate. And the models were fairly good if you would look at the ensemble. Individual models did not predict as accurately. If you give them full dry matter yield data, of course they can calibrate in, and that's the small box and whisker. The rice and the maize teams observed the same situation. So I think that the message there is that we need multi-model. I won't dwell on this because it's a little bit complicated, but the temperature response goes this direction, so the yield is being reduced in the different 4 sites. Box and whisker is larger with warmer temperature, so the wheat modeling teams observed that temperature was a very large uncertainty among the models. They felt they relatively agreed on the CO2 response. They already have finished this work with the hot cereal, but I won't show that. This shows the AgMIP rice team sensitivity to CO2, and this is percent response against CO2 all the way up to a doubling. And first of all, this box and whisker shows that there is a fair amount of uncertainty among individual models. So the message again is multi-model is more important. And I would say the same thing exists for the gridded models. There was not a relationship to photosynthesis method. So, okay, more mechanistic versus not didn't solve the problem. This group is now testing against CO2 face data at these are 4 locations in Asia. This shows percent yield reduction with rising temperature, 0, 3, 6, 9 degrees Celsius. And again, the box and whisker shows more uncertainty with rising temperature, and they are now testing against some elevated temperature data in controlled environments. The maize team, this shows the change in yield with increasing temperature, and the box and whisker. This group did not show increasing sensitivity at rising temperature. The models were relatively giving the same yield reduction, except there's more reduction at the warmer locations. Mostly it's caused with shorter life cycle, time to anthesis, maturity. Now, what was different about this group is they did the slope of temperature response under uncalibrated versus calibrated. It was not different. So site-specific calibration does not change the temperature relationships that the modelers have in the model. And I think that's an important thing. Okay, so using point-based models, I think a big question is how well they're parameterized and tested for response to temperature, CO2, water, nitrogen management. Another thing, and I would say this applies to the gridded models as well, how good are the site-specific inputs? If you start to create proxies for weather or soils or soil carbon, initial conditions, your precision starts coming down, okay? Or management information, you're making assumptions. The cultivar information, you can't use one cultivar across broad regions. You need to test the models against field data, and sometimes you can do this, particularly if you look at multi-year at a site, because the low rainfall years help you, and I'll use the word this way, you could potentially calibrate the soil's availability, rooting, or even the ET functions to improve the predictions, or the fertility aspects that depend on the good years. If you're testing against district yields, the way that Frank was describing, the way I would see this is that you need to represent the soils in that region, the range of sowing dates, range of management cultivars, and as soon as you start aggregating, the yield starts getting more averaged. I think that fit the same thing that you showed. One more slide. Okay, now we want to talk about genetic adaptation. I think it's very important to consider the limit, the feasible range of the traits. This means talking with the plant breeders, consulting the literature, the physiologists. And the first thing that I would do in this project, rather than use heat tolerance as proposed, is to try to regain life cycle. We know that's where plant breeders have done most of their adaptation to regions. And for most sites in the world, you can regain, except for trying to get to the really long cycles back, okay? It will be occurring at all regions as well. If you want heat tolerance, whoops, back up. That one, first of all, genetic variation is a little bit sparse among the species, and I think it's relatively small. And the other problem with this is that a lot of times a heat tolerance trait will show no benefit if you're in a cool site, cool seasons. The same way with the drought tolerance trait. You need to be in the serious drought years to have it show up well. So the more prominent one, I think, will be regaining life cycle. We have done some good work with the global futures groups with these commodities, particularly with ICRISAT and some of the other CG centers. I would also point out that adaptation has limits in management. If you're already at high nitrogen and water, you can't go much above that. And I would also argue that it's not safe to project technology trends in yield for 50 to 100 years. You're going beyond what the physiologists and plant breeders would say is possible. And I actually think we need to do a back yield casting of yield improvement and going future, looking at what's feasible in the genetic range. And it will be totally different in Africa than in the developed world because they're using poor varieties, low fertility. So your potential for gain is totally different depending on region. That's good.
Thanks,
okay.
While Christoph comes up, perhaps one.
Could you just explain the regaining life cycle concept?
Okay. Most models are basically heat unit dependent, and you would have certain degree days. And what I would propose is that the first set of simulations under historical, you know the anthesis and maturity date. Now go after the cultivar that you've used and just change the growing degree days to anthesis maturity to regain the same original anthesis and maturity date. This is the first thing that the farmers will do. They'll find a cultivar that's further south and they'll move it up north. They're already doing it. And I think the plant breeders have that available mostly.
One addition to that, we did
Yeah.
a study of 50 years historic data analysis. There's no evidence that farmers try to regain life cycle. It's going the opposite way in some cases.
Shorter?
Some crops, yes. But that depends on the crop and the region.
Yeah, it's region. I would say in the U.S. the maize harvest dates are the same, but the sowing date has moved earlier.
Yeah.
So, yeah. It's
Okay.
location specific.
Keep your questions.
Yeah.